Thank you for joining us. Today we have Dr. John Link, who's a breast oncologist, and we're here to talk about what it's like to have breast cancer and the aftermath. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa.
So not only are you an oncologist, but you're also an author, and we'll talk about the book later. Give me a little bit of idea of, we talk a lot about the diagnosis and the surgery and the treatments, but what happens afterwards once you've been through all of that? What can a patient expect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think over the years that's changed to some degree. When I first went into being a breast oncologist, which, by the way, I was the first breast oncologist in probably the Western United States.
Wow.
So I've been doing this for 30 plus years and have taken care of over 10,000 women with breast cancer.
Wow.
So, and when I first, and the point I'm trying to make is that when I first started as a breast oncologist, the prognosis, the cure rate for breast cancer was 55%, and presently it's up to 95%. So
Wow.
it's been over 30 years, we've made tremendous progress. And the disease, when a woman got the news that she had breast cancer, and oftentimes she would present with a lump because that was right at the time when mammograms were first coming forth, and a majority of women really presented with a much more advanced cancer with a lump rather than finding it before it's palpable. And the way breast cancer was diagnosed back then was that she would go to her primary doctor, who would refer her to a surgeon, and the surgeon would schedule her to have a breast biopsy in the hospital under anesthesia. So she would go in, and the surgeon would say to the patient, to the woman, if you wake up from your breast biopsy and you don't feel pain and you're not heavily bandaged, it was a benign biopsy. On the other hand, if you wake up and you're heavily bandaged, you unfortunately have breast cancer and you've had a mastectomy.
Oh gosh.
And mastectomy was really the only treatment at that point. So here we are today, 35 years later, and basically 70 to 80% of breast cancers are found before they're palpable. Majority of women choose to have a lumpectomy. There's much less deformity, and so things have changed dramatically.
Exactly.
So the reaction to the disease when you get the diagnosis is much different today than it was back then. Back then, there was a real threat for a woman that she would die from the disease. And one of the reasons that kept women away from going to the doctor with a lump, they had such fear and denial of breast cancer that they really went into a denial mode until they couldn't ignore it. Now women, I think, are much more motivated because they know if it's found early, the treatment is less deforming.
Right.
So to get back to your original question, once a woman's diagnosed, there's this acute treatment phase, and we treat in two kind of areas. One is local control, so we have to remove the cancer from the breast, and if there are any lymph nodes involved, we want the cancer out.
Right.
And then if there is risk that cells have escaped into the system, then we treat systemically to prevent recurrence.
Right.
And that is sometimes chemotherapy, much less chemotherapy than we used to use, but most often it's a hormonal treatment.
Right. Okay.
And that hormonal treatment lasts usually from 3 to 5 years, but some women that are at higher risk of recurrence will actually have 10 years of treatment. And there are at least 2 classes of hormone treatment. The one that is the oldest, is what we call a SERM, selective estrogen receptor modulator, and that is tamoxifen,
Okay.
which is an estrogen molecule, and its mechanism is that it doesn't stimulate hormone positive breast cancer like hormones do, like estrogen does. It is an analog to estrogen, and it goes to the cancer cell, hits those receptors, and blocks them and starves the cell from getting any kind of estrogen.
Okay.
And the cell dies.
Okay.
And then the other hormone treatment we use is an adrenal blocking drug called an aromatase inhibitor,
Okay.
which is only used in postmenopausal women.
Okay.
So the follow-up of a woman who's been diagnosed, number one, the prognosis is much, much better. And we are concerned about not over-treating women and around quality of life issues. And the two doctors that are most involved, one would be the breast surgeon, and it's usually her role or his role to watch over the breasts and monitoring for local recurrence and monitoring and protecting and finding early breast cancer out into the future.
Right.
Because once a woman has had breast cancer, she is more prone to get a second one. Not hugely so, unless she carries one of the genes.
Right.
So, but we continue to monitor for years into the future, and that's usually the breast surgeon's role.
Right. Okay.
If a woman needs systemic therapy, either hormonal therapy or chemotherapy, then the medical oncologist is involved during that treatment, and then usually continues to follow the patient every 3 to 6 months for around 5 years.
Okay.
And then once we hit these landmarks where the cure rate is expected to be very high, then we turn the patient over to her primary doctor.
Okay. All right. So obviously medically, you have it down from the beginning to the end. And I guess from an emotional standpoint, you know, how does a patient fathom all of that as, you know, during and then after? I mean, once you've gone through all of that, what kind of care is after? From an emotional standpoint, I mean, what would you
Right.
suggest?
So with the crisis of the diagnosis, emotionally most women are frightened. I mean, this potentially is a life-threatening disease, and it affects their total well-being, their hormones, their body to some degree. So the initial emotional reaction is one of fear, and then with education and basically meeting the challenge, most women get in a fighting mode.
Yep.
And understand they have a good prognosis and understand the risk and the benefits of the various treatments. And the surgery, oftentimes radiation with a lumpectomy, and the systemic therapy, if it's chemotherapy, that's a 6-month process.
Okay.
And if there's no chemotherapy, it's surgery and radiation, and that's a 3-month process.
Okay.
Once you hit that landmark, I mean that time frame where you've gotten through the acute phase, then there's obviously a sigh of relief, but there's still this concern, is it going to come back?
Right, right.
And that concern for many women never goes away. It's kind of a post-traumatic stress thing. So, and many women, every time they get a mammogram, every time they go to their cancer doctor's office, it brings up this trauma that they've had. But it gets easier as years go by. And some women really meet the fear head on and use it to their life's advantage, saying, you know what, this is threatening to me. It's made me appreciate the really good things I have in life, my family, my loved ones, my children, and I'm going to live life more fully. And Many of these women get involved in advocacy
Right.
and, the Komen walks, and there's kind of a breast cancer sisterhood
Right.
that exists.
Right. One thing I think we really like and have heard so much about is the Breastlink Angels, which is where the gals, they come back after they've had all their treatments from beginning to end, and then they're paired up with somebody who's
Yeah.
been newly diagnosed. What a great way to have a support system if that's what you want.
Yeah, it's really a nice program, and it's really good from both sides, because the newly diagnosed woman, really, it just is helpful to see someone who's made the journey and through it.
Right.
And then from the other side, it's very rewarding for that woman to be a role model and to educate her.
Right, right. Now, you have written a book here, the Breast Cancer Survival Manual. So I know you go through it and you're talking about kind of what we just talked about in terms of the process. But then in chapter 14, you talk about, what do you do after the fact? And obviously you've given us a little bit of link to it. If you were to tell somebody right now, here's what you can expect, like in an overview, what would you tell them?
Yeah, so I think it's important that that a woman has a kind of a health plan, personal health plan going forward that's really kind of delineated. So again, you get through the acute phase, and then there's this, for many women, there's a more protracted phase of hormone treatment, and then you're done, and then it's surveillance. And some of the issues into the future are bone health, this fear of recurrence and fear of another breast cancer. So
Right.
it's, monitoring your bones, getting your annual mammograms. One of the most important things for women with hormone-positive breast cancer to prevent recurrence or another breast cancer is really weight control.
Oh.
Keeping one's mean body mass down into a good range.
Okay.
So a BMI under 24.
Okay.
Vitamin D is important, we think. And then I think living healthy, eating well, exercising.
Right, right, which seems to be for anything right now.
Yeah.
And it never can hurt.
No.
Oh, well, good. Well, great. Any other things that you'd like to let us know about?
Right now, it's amazing. In my career, as I said, which spans 35 some years, the last 5 years have been the most productive around new breakthroughs and what's happening.
All right.
And in a number of areas. A couple of areas. One is that in the past we have had to overtreat women because we haven't known who potentially has cells that have escaped,
Right.
who is at high risk of recurrence. So we pretty much treated everybody. But now we can actually analyze the breast cancer and get some real good data that tells us if local control alone will cure a woman.
Right.
So
Right.
we often can avoid any kind of post-operative systemic treatment.
Okay.
The second big breakthrough is the development of targeted agents, because we now can look at the breast cancer genomically. We can do gene probes into the breast cancer, look at the mutated genes, which ones are mutated, and we now have a number of new agents potentially that we can target those mutations.
Right.
And so to us, that's very exciting.
Right, and that's not too far in the future either. That's like right now.
That's now.
Right, so it'll be interesting to talk to you again in a year or so and see sort of how that's been helping. Either diagnose quicker, maybe curing people quicker, to that extent. Thank you so much. It was
Okay.
very nice to have you.
Thank you.
All right,
Pleasure.
thank you. And if you are diagnosed with breast cancer, don't worry. There are lots of research and information that you can do online, as well as checking out the Breast Cancer Survival Guide.